5 years ago, my son Ethan Cole died in a hospital bed, and just before he took his last breath, he grabbed my wrist and whispered, "Mom, please don't let Megan struggle." I promised him I wouldn't, and every January after his funeral, I wired Megan $65,000 without asking a single question. I thought I was honoring my son, until a stranger named Helen Parker called me one afternoon and quietly said, "Mrs. Cole, I live next door to Megan in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I think you should see how she's really living." I expected a small apartment, maybe a modest life rebuilt after grief. But when I searched her name that night, I found photos of Megan beside a private pool, luxury cars, and a house worth nearly $1 million. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A wedding photo posted 2 years ago. Megan, in a white dress, standing beside a man I had never seen before. Smiling like my son had never existed. 5 years ago, when my son Ethan Cole died, the hospital room felt impossibly quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of every machine, every breath, every second slipping away. And just before the monitors flattened into a steady tone, Ethan squeezed my hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Mom, please don't let Megan struggle." And I remember nodding immediately, because in that moment I would have promised him anything, absolutely anything, just to ease whatever fear he was carrying into those final seconds. And after he was gone, that promise became something sacred to me, something I never questioned, something I followed with almost ritual precision. Every January I wired Megan $65,000. No discussion, no conditions, just a short message that read, "For the year ahead, take care of yourself." And Megan always responded with gratitude, sometimes with short calls where her voice sounded tired but polite, mentioning rising rent, unpredictable hours at the boutique she worked at, unexpected medical bills, nothing dramatic, just enough to make me feel like the money mattered. And each time I hung up, I felt like I was still taking care of Ethan in some small way, like I was still honoring the last thing he asked of me. And for 5 years I never visited because Megan had moved to Scottsdale shortly after the funeral, saying she needed distance, sunlight, a fresh start, and I respected that. Grief changes people, and I told myself she deserved space to rebuild her life. But the phone call from Helen Parker changed everything, because her voice wasn't dramatic or accusing, just careful and uneasy, like she wasn't sure whether she should even be speaking. And when she said, "Mrs. Cole, I live next door to Megan, and I think you should know she's not struggling," something inside my chest tightened, because it wasn't what she said, it was how she said it, like she was worried about what I might discover. And then she mentioned the cars first. A silver Mercedes convertible parked in Megan's driveway, sometimes a black Range Rover too, and I remember immediately thinking there must be some mistake. Because 2 months earlier Megan had told me her old sedan needed repairs she couldn't afford, and then Helen mentioned the house, 4 bedrooms. Modern design, backyard pool, gated neighborhood, and suddenly the version of Megan I had pictured for 5 years began to crack. But what unsettled me most was when Helen casually added, "She hosts parties, pretty big ones, at least once or twice a month." And I felt my fingers tighten around the phone, because the last time Megan and I spoke, she had told me she was working extra shifts just to cover expenses, and nothing about that matched what Helen was describing. And after we hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the framed photo of Ethan in his firefighter uniform, smiling in that calm, confident way he always had, and I found myself asking something I never thought I would ask. Had I misunderstood everything? Or had Megan let me believe something that wasn't true all along? And that night, unable to sleep, I opened my laptop and typed Megan's name into the search bar, expecting nothing, maybe an old social media account. But what appeared on my screen instead made my stomach tighten, because the first image that appeared showed Megan standing beside a pool, smiling confidently, wearing sunglasses, and behind her was a house that looked nothing like the tiny apartment she had described. And beneath the photo was a caption that read, "5 years ago I lost everything, today I'm grateful for the life I rebuilt." And for the first time since Ethan died, I felt something unfamiliar creeping into my thoughts. Not grief, not anger, but suspicion. And the more I scrolled, the worse it got: luxury dinners, vacations, parties, designer handbags. And then I saw the post dated 2 years earlier, Megan in a white dress, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. And the caption simply read, "New beginnings after loss." And that was the moment I realized something cold and unsettling. The woman I had been supporting for 5 years might not be the woman I thought she was at all, and before I even finished scrolling, I was already opening another tab, searching for flights to Scottsdale. Because suddenly, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I needed to see the truth with my own eyes. If you've ever trusted someone because of a promise you made to someone you loved, you understand why I booked that flight without hesitation. But what I discovered when I arrived in Scottsdale was far worse than anything I had imagined. I didn't sleep much the night before my flight, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face in that hospital bed and heard his voice asking me to take care of Megan, and I kept wondering whether I had misunderstood what that promise really meant. But by the time my plane landed in Scottsdale the next afternoon, my thoughts had shifted from doubt to quiet determination, because part of me still hoped Helen had exaggerated. Maybe Megan had simply done well for herself. Maybe the photos were misleading, maybe everything had a simple explanation, but that hope faded quickly as I drove into the gated neighborhood Helen had described. The houses grew larger, the streets quieter, everything looked polished and expensive, and when I finally saw Megan's house, I felt my hands tighten around the steering wheel, because it wasn't just large. It was the kind of home you see in magazines: wide glass windows, modern white walls, carefully designed landscaping. And parked in the driveway exactly where Helen said it would be was the silver Mercedes convertible, gleaming in the afternoon sun. And I sat there for a long moment, trying to reconcile the image in front of me with the version of Megan I had carried in my mind for 5 years. The struggling widow working extra shifts just to stay afloat. And nothing about this house looked like struggle. And just as I stepped out of my car, I heard another vehicle turning onto the street. And when the silver Mercedes pulled into the driveway and Megan stepped out, she froze the moment she saw me, her sunglasses still in her hand, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to alarm, and for a few seconds neither of us moved. Then she said my name softly: Linda. Her voice uncertain, and I realized in that moment she truly hadn't expected me to ever show up, which told me more than anything else could have. And she forced a small smile as she walked toward me, asking what I was doing in Scottsdale, and I told her I thought it would be nice to visit. And I watched the hesitation flicker across her face before she invited me inside, and the moment I stepped through the front door, the last pieces of doubt disappeared. The interior looked even more expensive than the outside: high ceilings, marble countertops, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a sparkling pool. Everything bright, clean, and carefully arranged. And Megan moved casually through the kitchen offering me water like this was completely normal. Like there was nothing unusual about the fact that she had never once mentioned any of it. And I asked her gently how long she had lived there, and she answered 2 years without hesitation. And that number landed heavily in my mind, because 2 years meant she had bought the house while still accepting my money. And when I asked whether she owned it, she said yes again, calmly, as if it required no explanation. And then I asked the question I had been holding back since I arrived, where the money came from, and Megan hesitated for the first time, her eyes shifting briefly toward the window. And then she told me something I hadn't expected. She said Ethan had left her well taken care of. And I felt my chest tight because I knew Ethan's finances. He had been responsible but not wealthy. And when I pressed gently, she finally admitted there had been a life insurance policy through the fire department. And when I asked how much, she said it quietly, like it wasn't important: about 1.2 million. And for a moment I couldn't respond, because for 5 years I had believed she needed help to rebuild her life. And all along she had received more money than I had even imagined. And I asked her why she never told me, and she shrugged slightly and said she didn't think it mattered. And the calmness of her answer unsettled me more than anything else. Because in that moment I realized something deeper: Megan hadn't hidden the truth accidentally. She had simply allowed me to keep believing something that benefited her. And just when I thought the conversation couldn't become more uncomfortable, she added one more thing, almost casually, saying she hadn't bought the house alone. And when I asked what she meant, she told me she had help. And when I asked who helped her, she looked directly at me and said, "My husband." And the word hit me harder than anything else she had said. Because for 5 years I had believed Megan was still alone, still grieving, still the woman my son had left behind. And suddenly I realized she hadn't been alone for a very long time. If you were in my position, would you still feel obligated to keep your promise? Or would you start to question everything the way I did in that moment? For a long moment after Megan told me she had remarried, the room felt strangely quiet, like something fundamental had shifted between us. And I realized I wasn't just learning new information, I was watching the meaning of my promise change in real time. Because for 5 years I had believed Megan was alone, vulnerable, someone who needed protection. But standing there in her bright Scottsdale kitchen, I could see clearly that she wasn't struggling. She wasn't rebuilding anymore. She had already built something new. And when I asked how long she had been married, she said 2 years, which meant she had accepted my money for 2 full years while building a new life with someone else. And when I asked whether her new husband knew about the payments, she nodded calmly and said yes. And that answer settled heavily in my chest, because it meant this wasn't just Megan quietly accepting my help. It meant two people had been building their life while I unknowingly supported part of it. And I asked her why she never told me, and she said she didn't want to complicate things. And I realized then that what she really meant was she didn't want to risk the money stopping. And that realization didn't make me angry the way I expected. Instead, it made me feel something colder, something quieter, like the moment you finally understand something you should have seen long ago. And I stood up slowly and walked toward the window overlooking the pool, sunlight reflecting off the water. And I thought about Ethan again, about the hospital room, about the promise I made without hesitation. And I realized something I hadn't considered before. Ethan hadn't asked me to fund Megan's future forever. He asked me to make sure she didn't struggle. And standing in that house, looking at that pool, I knew she wasn't struggling anymore. And when I turned back toward Megan, she was watching me carefully, almost like she already knew what I was thinking. And she asked quietly whether I was going to stop sending the money, and I told her honestly that I needed to think. And I left shortly after that, driving back to my hotel while replaying everything in my mind. And that night I called Robert Delgado, a longtime family friend and attorney. And after I explained everything, he told me something simple. He said promises are meant to protect people, not to create obligations that last forever. And those words stayed with me through the night. And the next morning I returned to Megan's house. And when she opened the door, she looked nervous, like she already sensed the conversation ahead. And I told her calmly that I had spent 5 years honoring my promise to Ethan. And I believed I had done that. Because she wasn't struggling anymore, she had security, a home, a partner, a future. And then I told her I would no longer be sending the yearly payments. And for the first time since I arrived, Megan looked genuinely unsettled, not angry. Just surprised, like she hadn't truly expected the support to end. And she asked quietly what I planned to do instead. And I told her the truth, that Ethan had spent his life helping people as a firefighter. And beginning this year, the $65,000 would go toward a scholarship fund for families of firefighters who lost their lives in service. And I watched Megan's expression shift as she realized what I was doing, not taking something away, but redirecting it somewhere that still honored Ethan. And after a long silence she nodded slowly, saying she understood. And as I walked back toward my car, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel betrayed the way I thought I might. I felt lighter, because for 5 years I had believed my promise tied me to Megan's life. But now I understood something deeper. Promises don't belong to the people we make them for. They belong to the people we make them about. And as I drove away from Megan's house for the last time, I looked once more at the quiet Scottsdale street, and I realized I hadn't broken my promise to Ethan at all. I had finally fulfilled it in a way that would help far more people than I ever imagined. Sometimes keeping a promise means letting go of the person you thought you were protecting, and choosing instead to protect the meaning behind the promise itself. If this story made you think about trust, family, and promises, tell me honestly. Would you have kept sending the money, or would you have done what I did?